Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining today's session. My name is Abby, I'm a consultant at Turner & Townsend. We're joined today by Kate Watson, who's a principal consultant at Turner & Townsend. So this is a Social Housing Retrofit Accelerator, or SHRA event, which is fully funded by the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero and is delivered by Turner & Townsend. I will hand over to Kate to kick off today's session.
Hi everybody, I'm Kate Watson. I'm a principal consultant here at Turner & Townsend, and hopefully can take you through the principles of consortia forming. So we're going to have a look at why you might want to form a consortium, or perhaps why you might want to join a consortium, what that might look like in terms of how you'd go about forming a consortium, managing a consortium, and then ending a consortium. And then we'll just finish off with some sort of top tips that summarize what we've gone through today. So why might you want to form, and I'm going to say join also, a consortium? Okay, so in terms of thinking about how it might help you as an organisation, there are some real pluses that you can get from joining or being the lead of a consortium. So firstly, you can pool resources. You can work together on joint procurement. This is quite important because you will have a bigger project and it will be more attractive to contractors to go for a bigger project than smaller ones. Also, when you're working across consortium, if there's several members, you're not competing necessarily for the same contractor on separate procurement as well. So you can deliver economies of scale. So again, depending on how you set your consortium up, you might, and we'll come on to this in a bit more detail, but you might want to work with a neighbouring local authority, or you might want to work with another housing provider working in the same area as you. And it might be that you've got properties in the same building. If it's a block, it might be you've got properties on the same estate, or it might be you've got properties in the same area, but they might be of a similar construction. And this is where we're looking at those economies of scale, where working together, as I said, can attract, you could work together with things like your design coordinator and architect if you need to do designs for something like EWI or that type of thing. But also when you go out to procurement, if you do a joint procurement, as I said, it's more work and contractors are generally a bit more interested. And then, you know, another really important one is that you can share those bid writing resources. When, you know, not every organisation has a bid writing team. Sometimes we've got project teams that are doing the bid writing as well as trying to run a project, and that can be quite challenging. And also they may not be an expert in bid writing, and it is a bit of a skill to be really good at writing bids. So where you might have somebody that's got a team with a bid writer that can be available, and they can lead on the bid writing, you know, you can pool your resources and work together on that. It's also a really good way of sharing ideas generally. Oh, you know, have you heard of this organisation, or have you heard of this particular measure? We're thinking of doing that. Has anybody worked with it? You know, you can get some feedback that way. So it's really helpful. And then in terms of other things, in learning from others, you can increase your skill knowledge. You can complement skills across organisations. So you may have some particular skills, as I said, we'll go back to that bid writing analogy. You might have somebody as a bid writer, and in another team they might have somebody that's like really a retrofit coordinator and really good at PAS 2035. So you can really bring people together to share skills and knowledge across the consortium. And yes, you can offer complementary service offerings across your consortium. So essentially there's 4 broad stages of consortium forming. So in the first stage, which is before forming a consortium, what you'd want to consider is why you want to do that, and who you might want to form a consortium with. I've already mentioned a couple of organisation types, so you'd consider that, but we'll come on to this in a bit more detail shortly. And then the second stage is how you form a consortium. So what do you need to look out for before enter into an agreement with another organisation? Then you need to look at the next stage, which would be managing that consortium, and that will depend on how you've set your consortium up and what the purpose of the consortium is for. And then when you get to the end of whatever the consortium is used for, how does that end? What do we need to what do we need to think about now as we move on to the next phase? So we will come into these a bit more detail on these. Okay, so when we look for partners for a consortium, there's lots of different things that we can consider before we move into it. I've already mentioned previously that sort of geographical location might be one of the things that you consider. So you're a local authority and you want to work with another local authority next to you, or a couple of local authorities in your area. It might be you're a local authority and you want to work with a registered providers that also work in your area. It might be your registered provider and you're wanting to form a relationship with others, again, in a regional context. Or it might be that there is another kind of overarching reason that you want to join a consortium. You might want to set up a strategic type consortium where you can, as I said, go to procurement and have more clout, if you like, with the contractors, because you're a large consortium that might have been set up for a longer term purpose. It might be that you're a small organisation, you haven't got a lot of retrofit experience and you want to join a consortium with people that are more experienced than you, that can help you through that process, particularly around that bid preparation side of things. As I said, you know, it could be some people that have got similar housing stock as you, and you want to share experience or procure for a similar housing stock. So there's no one particular reason why you should form a consortium. There are a number of different reasons that would work for a number of different organisations. So I think it's really fair to go back to that original question, which is, why are you interested and what purpose would it do to support you? But obviously, it's not just about you as a consortium lead or someone joining that consortium. It's about the other members and what they want. And it might not be that everybody has exactly the same idea. So we do need to consider that in the longer term. So some of those sort of key things to consider is like, is there someone that has the resources to prepare a funding bid, or are there several people within the organisations that part of that can do that work? Do you have the resources and skills to deliver the project? So again, that's sharing skills, advising team members, maybe other organisations within the consortia, where they can get those skills, where they can get that training, sharing your experience of procurement, your experience perhaps of working with particular suppliers. It might be that one organisation is much better at sort of going through the policy details and identifying the bid criteria and then sharing that. It might be that another team takes responsibility for project management and bringing all of that together. So, you know, there's lots of different ways you can work across a consortium to really share your experience and share the load as well. So moving into forming a consortium, there are lots of different considerations. So registered providers in your area, other members or external strategic groups. So I'm not sure who they might be, but there might be some smaller organisations that are different charitable status rather than a registered provider that you might want to bring in as well. They might not always be able to apply for SHDF funding, but it might be that they benefit from working in the consortium as well. So there are different ways that you can look at that. So we move those on. So I think we've gone through those. So there are different types of consortium as well. So you can have some sort of fairly informal collaboration agreements. Quite often you'd only set this up if you are very comfortable in the way that you're going to work with another organisation. You need to be very clear around certain things that we'll come on to in a bit more detail, but a lot of organisations will go for that second one, which is a written memorandum of understanding. So this just sets out clear parameters of how you'll work together, and I think, you know, it gives some assurances across the different organisations that, you know, you have something to fall back on. There are obviously more structured approaches. So some larger RPs have developed joint ventures. So they work at a consortium level that way. And, people like Bristol City Council have developed their City Leap program, and they're working with suppliers on a joint venture as well. So there's lots of different approaches that you can take. Okay, so we've thought about who we'd like to be in a consortium with, and we've thought about our approach to setting up a consortium, what the sort of legal structure would look like, or our legal agreement between us. And now we have to think about how, what other strategic actions we might want to consider. So by this, we might be, one partner's focus might be on achieving EPCC, where another partner's focus might be on fuel poverty. One partner might have really detailed social value requirements, and another may not have really thought about that at the moment. So I think it's really important that you come together and you understand your strategic requirements as an organization, and you share that across the consortium so that you can align where you can, and you're not bidding at odds to each other. So it doesn't mean that you all have to have the same strategic outputs. It's just trying to align across the consortia where you can, and identifying the differences where you need to. It's always good to have those financial and legal checks in place. I mean, I would say, particularly if you're a local authority, there is a number of hoops that you would need to jump through to get approval of this, and you'd certainly have to escalate that through that process. But even, in some of the smaller RPs where there's, less structured, tiered structure within the organisation, you would still need a CEO or a director sign off and an agreement as to how the consortium is going to work. And that goes back to that, what form of contract are you going to have between you, and making sure that your legal team are happy with that approach. In terms of the financial checks, this can be around making sure that people have enough money to go into that agreement with you, that they can deliver the consortium, the SHDF, the grant, and the project that you're applying for. But again, it really depends on how you've set up the legal structure and how you set up the consortium as to sort of how you might manage that. So you might have an agreement, for example, that you have, let's say you've got 10 members in a consortium, and there is an organisation that's taking the lead, and they are going to be managing the relationship with the grant funder and having to do all the reporting. So it might be that you agree to give 1% or 2% of your A&A costs to that lead consortium member to cover their administration costs in doing that role. It might be a higher amount, it might be a less amount, I'm not saying it has to be that amount, but you would want to agree that process. You'd also want to have a look at those kind of flows of money, but I think there's a separate slide on those, so we'll come to those shortly. So you'd also want to understand each other's capabilities and resources. So this is to understand how many people they have in an organisation to deliver this project. I think this is really key because not all organisations are the same. They don't all have the same numbers. So who is running the project? Who is going to be responsible for reporting each month and providing that information? Are they the same person that's running around on site and doing contract management and making sure the liaison officers are doing their job and sorting out all the firefighting? Because chances are, the reporting might fall down an urgency list if that's one and the same person. So it's certainly worth understanding what those information flows are and setting that out in the agreement at the front end, because at some stage, if you're successful in getting grant funding and you're in a consortium, there might come a point where you can't do the reporting on time because somebody's not providing you with the information. So it's really good to set out the requirements very early days so that you can meet those targets as well, and to know who is responsible for doing that. And yes, also to set out each others' responsibilities and insurances. So if you have, I don't know, a consortium where, you know, you've got a lead that takes the administration, but you might have some working groups where somebody takes a lead around PAS, somebody else takes a lead around planning requirements, and you form kind of little working groups. You would, to share resources and understanding, you might want to come together regularly to discuss that, and you'd want to set out what the requirements of those sort of working groups might be. Okay, so operational actions. We've talked a little bit about this, but agreeing the reporting requirements. Well, we tend to know what the reporting requirements are for government funding, because they do tend to put them in their guidance documents. So if you're the administrator of this scheme and you know that you've got to report to the government on the 10th working day of each month, probably what you want from your consortium members is you want the report for the last month sent to you, I don't know, let's say by the 8th working day of each month. That gives you 2 days to collate everything and then put your reporting into the department. I'd say that's a bit tight. You might want to say, you know, 5th working day of the month, something like that. But, you know, you need to set out some really clear parameters so people know what the requirements are. In terms of the governance procedures, so this might be setting up a steering group or a senior management meeting regularly, particularly if it becomes a much more formalised group or working together rather than a group just coming together to deliver a project for one round of funding. So, and normally people want to have that oversight. You know, let's say, for example, one of the members is failing to meet objectives, is not communicating very well. What you'd normally do is go to the next board meeting and escalate it to your sort of director and bring that up and say, what's going on? Why is this happening? We've tried all of these things. You know, we need to understand why you're unable to respond to all these emails, provide us with reporting, etc. So you'd want to have that governance route there so that you've got a good understanding of how you can, you know, what you can do when things don't work as well as they could do. We talked about when, you know, clarifying the endpoint of the consortium. Now, you might come together and want to put a consortium together to apply for grant funding because you think it would be helpful. You also think it would be helpful to work with people locally, but you might want to test it out on doing one project before you do anything more formalised. So the end of the project might be the date, everything is, all of the finances are completely finalised. You might not want to do it at the end of the grant funding date because actually the project is not finished at that stage. It might be you want to put a review date in there to consider how you would move into a more formalised structure after a successful delivery period. You might want to also consider how you would allow new people to join that consortium, or if people wanted to leave, what the process might be. So all of that again is kind of really useful stuff to do up front. And then, of course, we've talked about this already, about senior leadership partnership teams to be happy to proceed. I think it's really important that you can work out the mechanics to some degree with colleagues at a similar pay grade, but at some point somebody's got to say yes and be responsible. So getting the senior leader on board is really important. Okay, so we've done all that and we've moved into like managing the consortium now. And some of the things you might want to think about in terms of delivering. So we've talked a little bit about roles and responsibilities, but that might include understanding staffing requirements in the different consortium members. So who are the necessary resources in place to manage the day-to-day admin? And what happens when you don't have the right people in place? What if somebody leaves and there's a gap in their resource? So how do they manage that process? How do you get informed of that? That might lead to underperformance against the targets. So how are you going to manage a process of change management? So in SHDF, we will go through a change control board when we need to change the delivery profile, or perhaps the number of houses, or the types of measures, or the areas that they're in. So you would need to keep monitoring that with your different consortium members and understand what the particular blockers are for them. So, for example, it might be that you've got a planning application underway and it comes back that actually you can't proceed because there are some issues with your application. At that stage, your consortium member might need to go off, find a different bunch of properties. They're in a slightly different part of the borough, and the different type of properties, so they need different interventions. And then you come back and need to submit a change request to allow that process to go ahead formally with the agreement with the funder. So, you'd need to set all of that process up and identify who is responsible at what stage. I mean, obviously, if you're involved with SHDF at the moment, there is a control change process, and there's documentation that's in place. The government does have a tendency to tweak this every time they put a new funding round out, so it's likely that might change. But if you're involved with it now, you'd know what was involved with that process. So you can have an idea of what that might look like. So you could say, we will give you a change control form, you will need to complete it. We won't submit it until you've completed it, but we'll give you a month to turn that around. And then we'll take that to the change control board and we'll get it approved. And as soon as it's approved, we'll send it out, and we would expect you to start reporting on that process of delivery. You would need to manage risk. This is really key. So various different risks, and as you might be aware, fraud is much more becoming a more important aspect of government funded programs. So it's not just risk, it is also managing fraud, and how you would share that information and check on it regularly. And then we've got processes. So these are really important. How the finances work around your consortium, because normally you'll have a grant recipient. So that would be the consortium lead. They will sign the grant offer letter with the department, and they will receive the funding from the government. So then they'll have to distribute that funding to the different parties. So you'll need to set up supplier details, have a purchase order system, understand what the invoicing approach is, all of that normal stuff for payment. But it's really important that you understand what you need to do in order to get paid, because it's not just about putting an invoice in, it's probably about identifying and proving that you've had work submitted before that payment will take place. So we talked a lot about roles, responsibilities and accountabilities, so I'm not going to go over that particularly. But just in this process flow, it's really there's actually quite a lot to think through. It really helps if you've been involved with the delivery of a project before, because you'll know what some of those reporting requirements are, and you'll know that some of them are quite challenging. So, for example, quite often there's different ways that you can pay a contractor on completion of works. Some people will agree to pay them when the works are practical completion. Other organisations will say, well, I'm not paying you until you've lodged all your PAS certificates on the Trustmark site and I've got proof of that. So that also impacts potentially how somebody would allocate works as being completed. You might get somebody that says, well, that I know they've completed, we've been down there, we've signed them off, it's all good, but they haven't lodged the applications yet with Trustmark. So I'm saying that's done. And then you go to the next consortium member and they're saying, well, we know that the work's done, but the contractor hasn't lodged them. So as far as we're concerned, they're not completed. As the person that might be reporting, you need consistency around how you're going to report about that. And that needs to be shared across the consortium. Obviously, it needs to be aligned with the reporting requirements for the department, but it needs to be aligned across that. Sometimes, I think, using the similar example, there's different contracting types that you can take with your contractors. So some people like to use things like JCT intermediate contracts, where you'll have a valuation each month and then you'll get a final bill at the end of it. Others will use something like a JCT measured term, where you have a kind of call off particularly for each house. So you can put an invoice in for each individual house rather than from a group of houses. So again, this might affect the way that your finances accounted for, as well as the numbers of houses that are accounted for in each month and reporting period. So again, it's really, really important to sort of try and work through those with your consortium colleagues so that you're really clear about how you're going to run this. Dispute resolution is quite useful. It's never great. It's never a great subject matter to have as a sort of joining with another organisation to work together. But I think it's a really important understanding of how you will resolve disagreements or disputes in the process of running a consortium. I mean, they invariably come up. Generally, hopefully, they're not too difficult, but it is important to consider them. So previously, I know that organisations have done a collaboration agreement, and they've also shared the sort of the overarching department's requirements with consortium members. So they're essentially doing a flow down contract and a collaboration agreement, so that you're setting out very clearly what the requirements are, and then within that you'll have a process of kind of, if you don't achieve these and you don't resolve this within how many days, this is our dispute resolution process, just as you would with any supplier, really. I think communication is not one to be underestimated, particularly when you're entering into a consortium with colleagues on a government-funded scheme where their changes can take place. And if you are working on SHDF or a HUG program at the moment, you'll know that there's been often communications at a very last minute to get information in, or a lack of timely communication early on for kind of end of year reconciliation and things like that. So suddenly the person that's leading may be responsible for informing people in their consortium of a requirement at very short notice with a very quick turnaround. So there needs to be a very clear set out route for communication. So you might have regular consortium meetings every month, every 2 weeks. You might have a regular check-in with consortium members as if you're the lead, just to sort of have that more detailed overview of how they're performing in their project, any blockers, any issues, that type of thing. So you know, it's a bit like running your project for delivery, but also with all your different partners. I shouldn't say that really, because it's probably one of the things you could put yourself off doing, because it's that more people to communicate with and potentially more problems. But as I said at the front end, there are other benefits that you get from working in the consortium environment. Okay, ending a consortium. So again, we've looked at this at a very high level, but some of the things you want to think about at the end of a consortium are ownership of any assets or goods or leases or equipment purchased during the delivery of the contract. Again, partly this will be based on how it's set up. But let's say you have an administrating organisation that's doing the reporting, and they develop a load of resources to support the consortium members. Is that their IP? Have you paid them for an element of the administration? Would you have ability to access those documents afterwards if you weren't in a consortium? So again, it's just sort of going down an extra layer and thinking, oh, okay, would that be helpful? Is that part of our agreement? Should it be part of our agreement? So I think the other one is, on this one, is ongoing monitoring and evaluation. So you want to probably understand how well you're performing as a consortium, as to whether you would want to continue it or set up a new consortium or a more permanent consortium. So it's really good to understand how well you've been performing, what areas consortium members have not been performing in, perhaps areas that you could improve if you're a consortium lead or your own project, and think about how you will review that at the end of your consortium project period as a consortium, before potentially moving off into the next one, where you might go, well, you know, we'd really love to work with you again, but I really need to see a massive improvement in your reporting because it's not coming through timely and I'm having to chase you every month, and I don't really want to do that in the future. So how can you improve that part of your organisation to support the consortium going forward? In terms of, that's part of a sort of lessons learned. So you want to understand what the successes are, what the failures are, and the challenges you've encountered. I think we talk about this under our project management, but, you know, really we all need to be better when we're delivering projects at running a lessons learned aspect to it, because we spend a lot of time and energy delivering projects, and sometimes during the project or after the project, people move on or they retire, they move to another business, they move out of the country, whatever it is. So you often lose that knowledge at that point. So if you can have this sort of ongoing lessons learned, particularly when you're in a consortium, if you think about those communications opportunities, you could go, right, okay, we've got a consortium that's going to run for 3 years. Every 6 months, we're going to come together and we're going to do a lessons learned, and we're going to understand what the successes are, why they're successful, what the failures are, why we think they're not achieving what we set out to do, the challenges and how we've either been able to surmount them or where we need to go next time. And then when you get to that end point, regardless of who was there at the beginning, who was there at the end, you can bring that all together and have a look about, okay, how can we improve this? Do we want to take this forward? Okay, let's have a look at our memorandum of understanding, our collaboration agreement, whatever it is that you've got in place, and let's bring this in. And it might be, we're only going to work with you if your senior leadership appoint a admin assistant to do the reporting each month. 0.3 FTE is all you really need. They need to allocate that, and I need to get confirmation from you that that's what you're going to give, because you've failed to do your regular reporting. And that might be something that is relatively easy, or it might mean that it's that consortium doesn't proceed with a particular member because they're unable to achieve that, and that might be okay, because the outcome is that you want the best outcome for most of the consortium members. So as I said, did all the partners find the consortium mutually beneficial? And is there an interest in continuing to work together? And I think, are there any ways that you could share learning better or share resources better? Because I think sometimes some consortiums can be very much like, there's a number of people that come together, but we're all working independently on our projects, and we don't often come together and share our experiences. So there can be opportunities to get better at doing that, and it really is a case of upskilling everybody when you come together and can share your experiences afterwards. Okay, so we're nearly at the end of the presentation. Some really top tips. Start early. So there is going to be more funding for SHDF this year. Hopefully we'll get an announcement sort of early summer. So keep an eye out. If you don't get updates from the department, maybe sign up for them so you'll know when they've released any of their policy. We obviously will let you know if we hear anything or when we hear anything, but you can get direct updates from the department. It takes a while to get all the information and governance structures in place, particularly if you have to go through, as I said, your leadership team and a sign-off process in your organisation. So the earlier you start on that, the better it's going to be. And that means you can get the consortium in place, and then you can focus in, okay, what's our project and how are we going to run that together as an organisation. So I have done this, and I did find it quite challenging for me in my capacity with all the other projects that I was running, and the amount of people in my team that I could pour on their resource to actually work with the other organisations we were trying to set up a consortium with. So it was quite challenging. We were trying to do it at the same time as writing a funding bid. So I would recommend definitely start a bit earlier than when the funding bid comes out if you can. What are the critical needs of your project? That's what you really fundamentally need to drill down to. There's a lot of things we say when we put an application together, but what do we fundamentally want to deliver from our project? Do we want to deliver 40 houses really well to a really good standard that we can monitor and know the outcome of? Do we want to deliver 200 lightweight kind of single measure installations to move everything up into that EPCC, but not really tackle it further than that? What are our key criteria? So really understand how that fits again. Let's going back to what's your strategic purpose and how does that fit in? And then let's bring that together and create this shared project plan so that you know what you're doing. So we've got here, spend time creating a shared project plan and don't expect everybody to fall in line with your ideas. So that seems sort of slightly counterintuitive to me, but I think when you come together to share that project plan, partly it's around how you get from, we've created this consortium and we're doing a shared funding bid, who's going to do what in that process, but also it's the next steps afterwards. So we've submitted our funding application, there's a period where it's being reviewed. Is there anything we need to do in that period where it's being reviewed, assuming that we'll get funding to move forward when we hear that we've been successful? So it might be that you've done everything to get to the point of submitting your funding application, but you haven't actually formalized the consortium. So perhaps once you've done your funding bid, you can then concentrate on formalizing that consortium subject. You might make it subject to being successful. You might not make it subject to being successful. It might be, okay, well, even if we're not successful, it might be useful for us to work together to work on other projects, you know, to share this doing a consortium approach to going out to tender for other work. So, you know, there could be wider applications than just for an SHDF application. But it's really good to create things together as a consortium if you can, and you get more buy-in that way. It might be that some people's plans line and that's okay, but where you can work together to agree what that looks like, you'll get a better buy-in generally. Again, just to reiterate, each partner will bring something significant and additional to the collaboration. So even if you're a really small organization that hasn't got a lot of experience in retrofit, you might have a small organization with a few houses but have a very detailed type of a specific remit. You might deal with let's say homeless young people, rehousing homeless young people, and there might be something there that another larger organization could learn from the approach that you take. Obviously, if you're a more experienced organisation that's delivered retrofit before and you're working with organisations that are less experienced, you've got a wealth of information that you can share and support others with. You might have done a very hard to treat archetype before, and it might be your other consortium members have a number of those archetypes in their area or in their project, and they want to learn from your experience, whether that was a successful experience or, do you know what, it was a really painful experience, but we've learned so much from it, let me share that with you. Because that's the way we grow in this sector, is by sharing our experience, collaborating together, and these are perfect vehicles to do that. So let's make sure that we all know who's going to deliver what. That's part of those, making those roles and responsibilities really clear right from the beginning. Thinking about the mechanics of the collaboration, so that's the processes, who's responsible, lines of accountability, all of that type of thing, SLAs. And then spend some time getting that consortium agreement right. Don't rush into it. If it's not right for you, raise it. Let's see how we can formalise it in a way that suits you for what your needs are. Okay, we've got one more slide, which is very quick. So there are some resources that you can look at. So there's links here, and I think Abby said that you'll get the slides. So feel free to go and have a look. There's lots of information. And that is actually the end of the slideshow.